What do samurais, Italians, and the American West all have in common? At first glance, practically nothing. But that isn't exactly true. As it turns out, they were the perfect catalyst needed to create a film franchise that would become one of Hollywood's most well-known trilogies of all time. I am of course referring to Sergio Leone's Dollars trilogy, starring Clint Eastwood, Lee Van Cleef, John Maria Volonte, and Eli Wallach. This series, loved by film fanatics and casual viewers alike, breathed new life into the Western genre through its striking cinematography and unique visual editing techniques. Sergio Leone created a representation of the West that blurs the lines between history and myth. Christian Yuva said in his book, Sergio Leone, Cinema as a Political Fable, that Leone's cinema appears too realistic for a fable, but also too fable-like for a reality. But where do samurais fit in? And what made Leone's work so compelling? Well, it begins a little strangely with a seemingly unrelated piece of film. Akira Kurosawa's Yojimbo, a samurai film from 1961 that Leone took much inspiration from. Maybe a little too much. Akira Kurosawa's Yojimbo follows a lone samurai as he wanders into a town. There, he discovers two feuding families and spends his time inciting conflict between them for his own gain. He discovers a couple and their son caught up in the family's feud and decides to help free them and frames one of the families for the couple's escape. Ultimately, he is discovered, captured, beaten, and then escapes in a coffin. He returns to the town to save a shopkeeper he befriended and finally rid the town of the corrupt families and their feud. Sound familiar? Leone's Fistful of Dollars plot is identical. Swap out the feudal Japan setting and samurai for a cowboy in the American West and you've got yourself Leone's first Western. The story plays out the same way in both films. Although, even in Leone's first Western, we begin to see the makings of his signature cinematographic techniques sprinkled throughout, such as his love of close-ups juxtaposed with extreme long shots. Christian Yuva continues in his book, stating that contradiction is the key feature in Leone's cinematic attitude, which is why he intentionally juxtaposes shots that are visually jarring. Leone also shows action differently. Take the first confrontation scene in Yojimbo and Fistful of Dollars, for example. Kurosawa shows us the action from a distance, viewing the samurai's assault as a bystander, whereas Leone shows us the action by cutting between close-ups and inserts as tensions rise leading up to a shot almost from the gun's point of view. Yojimbo rarely gives us a close-up. Leone recognized this and took the opportunity to make those integral scenes even more compelling and intense. Even though Fistful of Dollars is essentially a knockoff of a pre-existing film, Leone added his own flair that makes his film stand out from others. Leone's second film in the Dollars trilogy, For a Few Dollars More, is often overshadowed by The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Arguably a better film than its follow-up, For a Few Dollars More continues to push Leone's cinematographic vision. The opening shot of For a Few Dollars More is unusual. To open Fistful of Dollars, his previous film, the credits play on a black and red background as silhouettes of gunmen shoot at each other while the main theme of the movie plays. A visually striking choice that keeps the viewer's attentions as the opening credits appear. Leone practically does the opposite to open For a Few Dollars More. The film fades in from red to reveal a lone rider crossing a plain in an extreme long shot. A gunshot rings out and the rider falls off his horse dead. The credits and theme play, but this time over a 4-minute, static, uncut shot of a stationary subject in an extreme long shot. Keith Brown wrote in his journal, editing in Leone's The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly and Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch, that Sergio Leone favored drawing attention to his editing. We experience this intentional visual editing when Mortimer sees the wanted poster for Indio. The camera cuts back and forth between Mortimer and the poster incredibly fast, a contrast of the feeling evoked by the slow opening of the film, and it's impossible to miss. At the conclusion of this film, we have the type of scene that Leone is most known for, the standoff. Cutting between long shots and close-ups, Leone creates a level of suspense that would be unachievable without the use of his visual editing. Leone's most well-known film, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, opens with a sequence far more reminiscent of his Fistful of Dollars credits, with colorful and attention-grabbing visuals. It then cuts immediately to a close-up of a man looking directly into the camera, and then to his gaze over an empty town, making it very clear you're watching a Leone film. This film follows 3 protagonists, each representing one of the adjectives mentioned in the title, as they race to recover a dead soldier's treasure, eventually resulting in the most famous Leone standoff scene. The cinematography Leone employs more freely in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly are wide shots. For example, as Blondie, the good, is paraded through the desert by Tuco, the ugly, we are reminded of how desolate it is with the long shots that make the protagonist minuscule within the frame. This is also seen during the final standoff in the center of the graveyard. Nearing the end of the film, when Tuco finally makes it to the graveyard where the treasure is buried, we follow him as he runs between the graves and the best score imaginable plays. He searches the massive graveyard as disorienting shots of spinning graves are cut in, placing the viewer into the frantic mind of Tuco as he desperately searches for the gold. The edit is simple and less visually jarring than Leone is fond of, yet effective in adding to the confusion and urgency of Tuco's action. Later, once all three protagonists arrive at the graveyard, they all have a classic Leone standoff, complete with close-ups juxtaposed with long shots. After The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, Eastwood moved on to other projects, but that didn't stop Leone from making more westerns. Although not as widely known as his Dollars trilogy, Leone's 2 additional westerns are worth mentioning. Leone's penultimate western is Once Upon a Time in the West. Throughout this film, Leone's close-ups are used more often than the other films. Almost every scene manages to effectively use a close-up to intensify the moment, such as when Harmonica meets Frank and his goons, Cheyenne intimidating a local to break his chains, Morton dreaming of the sea, Harmonica telling Frank the names of those he's killed, and the final standoff between Frank and Harmonica. There is one final western that Leone created, one that is rarely mentioned and almost totally overlooked. That would be
Duck, you sucker.
Leone seems to cut loose a little bit in this film. The story follows Juan and John, who are a bandit and an explosive expert during the Mexican Revolution. Throughout this film, there are innumerable close-ups. During one of the first scenes, there are several extreme close-ups of the passengers in the stagecoach where Juan is riding. After that, almost all other lines are done in close-ups or something closer than a medium shot. It doesn't really feel like a Leone Western. It's missing the surreal, almost dreamlike representation of the West that Leone created. Although it uses Leone's staple close-up, the frequency of those close-ups reduces their effectiveness. And strangely enough, this is the only Leone Western that does not have a titular standoff. Even though this film is an enjoyable watch, it isn't surprising that not everyone is aware of it. Sergio Leone created some of cinema's best and most well-known westerns through his striking cinematography and visual editing. In a review by Gary Crowdis of Christopher Frayling's spaghetti westerns, Cowboys and Europeans from Karl May to Sergio Leone, he states that Leone's films are not merely an extension or revitalization of the visual cliches of the Hollywood Western, but that indeed, his films constitute a type of critical cinema. That is to say that Leone used the Western cliches established through American cinema and blended in his own vision to create the mythological Western world that never really existed. Throughout all of Leone's films, his approach and techniques elevated the genre's most notable facets, which established him as one of the greats of the American Western.